Imagine the air, thick and heavy with the scent of copal incense and damp earth, clinging to your skin like a second soul. The only light is the mad dance of torchlight, casting long, distorted shadows that writhe against the stone walls of a pyramid. A man-made mountain reaching for the stars. The jungle isn't silent. It's alive with a symphony of the unseen. The rasp of a jaguar, the chatter of 1,000 insects, the low, rhythmic chanting of priests that seems to vibrate not in your ears, but in the very marrow of your bones. This is the world of the Maya, a civilization we think we know. We see their impossibly precise calendars, their staggering architectural genius, their sophisticated understanding of mathematics and the cosmos. And we build a picture of a people of pure intellect, of serene stargazers and wise philosophers. We see the ruins at Chichen Itza and Tikal as silent monuments to a lost golden age. But that picture, the one you see in documentaries and textbooks, is dangerously incomplete. It's a comfortable lie we tell ourselves, because carved into those same stones, hidden in the intricate folds of their mysterious glyphs, and whispered in the fragmented stories of their descendants, is another truth. A truth that is visceral, carnal, and to our modern sensibilities utterly terrifying. Before we pull back that veil, before we step into the heart of this forgotten world, I want you to do something for me. If you're the kind of person who believes that history isn't just about kings and dates, but about the raw, messy, and passionate pulse of human life, then hit that like button. Subscribe, because we're not just reciting facts here. We're embarking on a journey together into the shadows of the past. And comment below, let me know where in the world you're joining this expedition from. It's a constant source of wonder to me that we can connect from every corner of the globe, united by a shared curiosity for the stories that made us who we are. Now take a deep breath, because the story we're about to uncover is not one of serene astronomers. It's a story of blood, sacrifice, and a view of sexuality so alien, so deeply intertwined with the sacred and the savage, that it will fundamentally change how you see this legendary civilization. The Maya believed the universe was born from a divine sexual act. The cosmos itself was a product of cosmic intercourse. Their creation story, the Popol Vuh, speaks of gods who had to spill their own blood, their own essence, to give life to the world. And for the Maya, that divine act wasn't a one-time event. It was a cycle that had to be perpetually renewed, refueled, and reenacted by humanity. Creation wasn't a spectator sport, it was a participatory mandate. And the fuel for that cosmic engine, it was the most potent, life-giving substances they knew, blood and semen. To them, these weren't just biological fluids, they were the physical manifestation of life force. Of Ka, the sacred essence that animated all things. Semen was the seed of mankind, and blood was the seed of the gods. To combine them, to offer them, was to participate directly in the ongoing creation of the universe. This wasn't about pleasure in the way we understand it. It wasn't about love or romance. It was a duty, a terrifying, painful, and ecstatic duty. The line we draw between the bedroom and the temple, between personal desire and public worship, simply did not exist for them. The body was not a private vessel for individual experience. It was an altar. And the most sacred rituals were performed upon this altar of flesh and blood. Imagine a young nobleman, perhaps no older than 16, chosen for the highest honour. He has spent weeks in ritual purification, fasting, praying, ingesting hallucinogenic substances to open his mind to the spirit world. He's not being prepared for a wedding. He's being prepared for a sacrifice of a different kind. On the night of the ceremony, he is brought before the community, to the top of that pyramid. The chanting reaches a fever pitch. The air is electric with anticipation. He is not afraid. He is exalted, because he is about to feed the gods. The high priest, adorned in jaguar skins and the brilliant green feathers of the Quetzal bird, approaches with an instrument that looks like a nightmare. It's a stingray spine, a viciously sharp serrated barb, holy in its power to draw forth the sacred essence. And in a moment of supreme religious ecstasy, witnessed by the entire community, this young man, this vessel of the gods, will take that spine and perform an act of autosacrifice that is almost impossible for us to comprehend. He will pierce his own penis. Not once, but multiple times, threading a rope through the perforations. A rope that has been studded with thorns to maximize the flow of blood. The pain is unimaginable, transcendent. But it is not a punishment. It is a portal. His blood, the most sacred offering, drips onto pieces of bark paper, which are then set ablaze. The smoke from this offering, carrying his life force, his very soul, rises to the heavens to nourish the gods, to ensure the sun will rise tomorrow, that the rains will come, that the corn, the very substance of their life, will grow. He is a conduit between the mortal and the divine, and his agony is the price of cosmic balance. This wasn't a rare or extreme event performed by a fringe cult. This was a cornerstone of Maya cosmology, practiced by kings, by nobles, by the elite who were considered closest to the gods. We know this not from speculation, but from their own art. Stelae, lintelals, and painted ceramics from cities like Yaxchilan depict their rulers, their kings, engaged in this very act. King Shield Jaguar the Cud is shown pulling a thorny rope through his tongue, while his wife, Lady Zook, performs the same ritual. But for men, the most potent, the most powerful offering came from the source of creation itself, the penis. It was the ultimate act of giving back to the gods the life force they had been granted. This was a society where sexual organs were not hidden in shame, but displayed as instruments of divine power, tools for negotiating with the cosmos. And what we've just described, as shocking as it is only the beginning. It's the entry point into a world where the boundaries of pain, pleasure, and piety completely dissolved. What happened when this act was not performed alone, but between partners? What was the role of women in these blood-soaked rituals of fertility? And what happened when the gods demanded not just blood, but the ultimate sacrifice? The role of women in this sacred, terrifying theatre of the flesh was just as crucial, and in many ways, even more complex. While the men offered the seed of mankind, the noble women of Maya society were the conduits for the blood of their divine lineage. Their bodies, like the men's, were altars, but the rituals they performed were uniquely their own, imbued with a different kind of cosmic significance. For a woman, the offering was not from the organ of creation, but from the organ of speech, the tongue. Imagine Lady Zook, the queen of Yaxchilan, a powerful figure in her own right, kneeling in the torchlit chamber of a temple. Her husband, the king, has just performed his own agonizing ritual of genital perforation. Now it is her turn. She is not a passive observer. She is an active participant in this cosmic transaction. The priestess hands her the same sacred implement, a rope studded with the razor-sharp thorns of a ceiba tree, the sacred world tree of the Maya that connected the heavens, the earth, and the underworld. With a serenity that belies the excruciating pain she is about to inflict upon herself, she pierces her own tongue, not a simple pinprick, but a deep gouging wound through which she will pull the entire length of this horrific rope. The blood flows freely, a torrent of crimson that soaks the bark paper laid out before her. This is not just her blood. It is the blood of her ancestors, a lineage that stretches back to the gods themselves. By offering it, she is reaffirming her divine right to rule, her connection to the supernatural forces that govern their world. The pain is a key, unlocking a door to another reality. As the blood flows, as the pain intensifies, she enters a trance-like state, a vision quest. The smoke from the burning, blood-soaked paper billows around her, and in that smoke, she sees the face of the vision serpent, the messenger of the gods, the gateway to the underworld. From the serpent's gaping maw emerges the spirit of an ancestor, or a deity, who will impart crucial wisdom, prophecies of war, guidance on agricultural cycles, the secrets of the cosmos. Her suffering is not just an offering, it is a form of communication, a bloody and brutal telephone line to the gods. This ritual, this act of glossotomy, was central to the power of Maya queens. It was a public performance that legitimized their spiritual and political authority. It demonstrated their fortitude, their piety, and their unique ability to bridge the gap between the mortal and the divine. But what of sexuality in a more conventional sense? What about the act of intercourse itself? For the Maya, even this was rarely a private affair, divorced from religious obligation. The timing of sex, especially among the nobility, was dictated not by passion, but by the stars. The sacred 260-day calendar, the Tzolk'in, governed every aspect of their lives, and the act of conception was a cosmically significant event that had to be perfectly aligned with auspicious dates. To conceive a child on a day of ill omen was to invite disaster. To risk bringing a cursed soul into the world, astrologer priests would be consulted to determine the most favourable conjunctions of celestial bodies, the moments when the cosmic energies were perfectly aligned for the creation of a future ruler or priest. Sex became a scheduled ritual, performed not in the pursuit of pleasure, but in the service of the state and the cosmos. And it wasn't just about timing. The act itself could be a ritual performance. While the most extreme bloodletting ceremonies were public spectacles, there is evidence to suggest that ritual intercourse also played a role in their religious practices. Certain temple complexes, like those at Uxmal, are adorned with a profusion of phallic sculptures. These aren't crude graffiti, they are sacred symbols of fertility and creative power. Some scholars interpret these sites as centres of a kind of sacred prostitution, where ritual sex was performed to honour the gods of fertility and ensure the fecundity of the land and its people. The participants in these rites would not have been seen as debased, but as vessels of the divine, their bodies used to channel the creative energies of the cosmos. It was a form of worship that was profoundly physical, a rejection of the idea that the spirit could be separated from the flesh. But this deep connection between sexuality and divinity had a darker side. If sex was a source of cosmic power, then it could also be a source of cosmic pollution. Adultery, for instance, was considered not just a personal betrayal, but a tear in the sacred fabric of the community, an act that could bring the wrath of the gods down upon everyone. The punishments were brutally severe. An adulterous man might be handed over to the wronged husband, who had the legal right to drop a heavy stone on his head, crushing his skull. The adulterous woman often faced an equally grim fate, sometimes death by strangulation. There was no concept of a crime without a victim. In their worldview, the entire community was the victim of such a transgression. This obsession with ritual purity extended to all forms of sexual activity. Homosexuality, for example, is a subject of intense debate among Mayanists. Some early Spanish chroniclers, like Bishop Diego de Landa, wrote with horror of the Mayas' apparent acceptance of homosexual practices, even suggesting the existence of male brothels where boys were sold for sexual purposes. However, these accounts are heavily biased, written through the lens of a deeply homophobic 16th century Catholic worldview. The Spanish were often looking for justification for their conquest, and painting the indigenous peoples as sexually deviant was a common tactic. The Mayas' own art is more ambiguous. There are some ceramic figurines that depict what appear to be homosexual acts, but their context is unclear. Were these depictions of everyday life, mythological scenes, or warnings against taboo behaviour? The truth is likely far more complex than the Spanish accounts would have us believe. It's possible that certain forms of same-sex relations were tolerated or even integrated into ritual life, while others were condemned. What is clear is that their understanding of sex, gender, and desire was fundamentally different from our own. It was a fluid and often dangerous landscape, where every act had the potential for either divine favour or catastrophic wrath. It was a world where a young man piercing his own genitals was an act of supreme piety, and a queen bleeding from her tongue could decide the fate of an empire. But the bloodletting from their own bodies was not always enough. Sometimes the gods were hungrier. Sometimes the cosmic balance was so precarious that it required the ultimate offering, the ultimate fusion of sex and death. And that is when the captives of war, the slaves, and sometimes even their own people would be brought to the top of the pyramid for a final, horrific purpose. The ultimate expression of this terrifying worldview, the point where sexuality, sacrifice, and cosmic duty converged in a symphony of horror, was in the practice of human sacrifice. This wasn't the random, chaotic violence of a savage people. It was a calculated, ritualized, and deeply meaningful act, the final and most potent offering they could make to the gods who they believed had sacrificed themselves to create the universe. For the Maya, the cosmos ran on a sacred debt. The gods had given their blood, their very being, to create humanity and the world they inhabited. It was therefore humanity's solemn obligation to repay that debt, to feed the gods with the same life force, to keep the cosmic machinery from grinding to a halt. And the most precious, most potent fuel for that machinery was a still beating human heart. The victims of these rituals were often high-status captives, taken in battle from rival city-states. This was not a coincidence. To sacrifice a king or a powerful nobleman was to capture not just his body, but his life force, his cur, and to offer that divine energy to one's own patron gods, thereby strengthening one's own city and weakening their enemies. War, for the Maya, was not primarily about territory or resources. It was about capturing sacrificial victims. A successful military campaign was one that returned with noble captives destined for the altar. Imagine the scene, a scene we know has played out time and again in cities like Palenque and Tikal. A captive lord who, just weeks ago, commanded armies and lived in a palace, is now stripped naked, his body painted blue, the colour of sacrifice. He is forced to play a final, ritual ball game in the Great Ball Court. But this is not a game he can win. It is a piece of political and religious theatre, a reenactment of the cosmic struggle between the heroes of the Popol Vuh and the lords of the underworld, Xibalba. His inevitable defeat is a foregone conclusion. After the game, he is led, or dragged, up the steep steps of the main pyramid. The crowds below are not sombre or mournful. They are in a state of religious frenzy, a collective ecstasy. The air is thick with the sound of drums, flutes, and the deafening roar of the assembled populace. At the summit, 4 priests, also painted blue, grab him by his arms and legs, bending him backwards over a convex stone altar, arching his chest towards the sky. A 5th priest, the Nacom, approaches with the sacrificial blade, a beautifully crafted flint or obsidian knife, lethally sharp. With a single expert motion, he plunges the knife into the captive's chest, just below the ribcage, and rips it open. He reaches into the gaping cavity, severs the arteries and trachea, and pulls out the still-beating heart. He holds it aloft, a steaming bloody offering to the sun, to the god Kinich Ahau. This was the ultimate nourishment. The body, now just a lifeless shell, is then kicked and rolled down the steps of the pyramid, a bloody cascade that ends in a crumpled heap at the bottom. But the horror did not always end there. There is significant evidence, both from art and from the study of human remains found in sacred cenotes or burial sites for ritual cannibalism. To consume the flesh of a sacrificed enemy, particularly a powerful one, was to absorb his strength, his spirit, his cur. It was the ultimate act of domination and a sacred communion, a way of internalizing the divine energy that had been released through the act of sacrifice. And in this maelstrom of ritual violence, sex was never far away. The act of sacrifice was profoundly linked to fertility and creation. The shedding of blood upon the earth was seen as a way of fertilizing it, ensuring the growth of the maize that was the staple of their diet. The Maya word for semen and maize gruel were often related, as were the words for blood and sap of the tree. Life, sex, blood, and sacrifice were all points on the same sacred continuum. Sometimes this connection was made shockingly explicit. There are depictions in Maya art that show men engaged in intercourse with a goddess as they are being sacrificed, their life essence, both blood and semen being offered at the moment of death. It is the ultimate fusion of creation and destruction, a moment of terrible divine ecstasy where the boundaries between life and death, pain and pleasure, are completely obliterated. The victim becomes a god in the moment of his demise, his death a creative act that helps to sustain the universe. This wasn't limited to male captives. While men were the most common victims of heart extraction, women and children were also sacrificed, though often in different ways. Children seen as pure and uncorrupted were considered particularly potent offerings to the rain god, Chaak. They were often drowned in sacred cenotes, the natural limestone sinkholes that the Maya believed were portals to the underworld. The remains of hundreds of individuals, many of them children, have been dredged from the sacred cenote at Chichen Itza. Analysis of their bones often shows that they were not locals, but had been brought from hundreds of miles away, suggesting a vast network of tribute and sacrifice. Women were also sacrificed, sometimes in ceremonies related to the moon goddess or other female deities. They might be decapitated, their heads displayed on skull racks, or their bodies dismembered in complex rituals designed to mirror mythological events. The sheer scale and variety of these practices are staggering. But it is crucial to remember that for the Maya, this was not murder. It was not an act of wanton cruelty. It was a fundamental necessity, the price of existence. They believed they lived in a precarious, dangerous universe, one that was constantly on the brink of collapse, and only through these continuous, bloody offerings could they hope to maintain balance and ensure their own survival. This was a worldview forged in the unpredictable environment of the Central American jungle, where life and death were in constant, visible struggle. It was a world where a sudden drought could wipe out a year's harvest, where a jaguar could snatch a child from the edge of a village, where the gods seemed both intimately present and terrifyingly demanding. Their sexual and sacrificial practices, as horrifying as they seem to us, were their response to that reality. They were their way of making sense of a chaotic world, of imposing order on the universe, and of participating directly in the sacred drama of creation. It was a system of belief that sustained their civilization for over 1,000 years, fueling their art, their science, and their wars. But as we will see, this very system, this insatiable need to feed the gods, may have contained the seeds of their own mysterious downfall. The intricate and brutal system of ritual that defined the classic Maya period, from roughly 250 to 900 AD, was a double-edged sacrificial blade. For centuries, it provided the cosmological glue that held their society together. It legitimized the power of the Kuhul Ajor, the holy lords who ruled their city-states. It gave meaning to life, death, and the often harsh realities of their existence. But this same system, predicated on constant warfare for captives and an ever-increasing demand for blood offerings, created a society that was perpetually on a razor's edge. The very practices that were meant to ensure cosmic stability may have, in the end, sown the seeds of their own societal collapse. Think of the psychological and social pressure. The king's primary duty was not to be a great administrator or economist, but to be the chief intermediary with the gods. His legitimacy was written in the blood of his enemies and in the scars on his own body. A king who failed to secure captives, who failed to perform the grueling auto-sacrificial rituals, or under whose reign the rains failed or the crops withered, was seen as having lost favour with the gods. His authority would crumble, not because of a political misstep, but because of a perceived spiritual failure. This created a relentless cycle of escalating violence. To prove their divine mandate, rival kings had to constantly outdo one another in the theatre of ritual. They had to wage more wars, capture more high-status enemies, and perform more elaborate and painful sacrifices. The inscriptions on their monuments are not just historical records, they are propaganda, a form of spiritual and political one-upmanship. A stela at Naranjo boasts of its king having piled up the skulls of his enemies. Another at Piedras Negras details the capture and sacrifice of the ruler of a rival city, an event celebrated as a major triumph. This constant ritualized warfare was not sustainable. It drained resources, diverted manpower from agriculture, and created a climate of endemic instability. And as the classic period wore on, the demands of the gods seemed to grow. Archaeological evidence suggests that the scale of human sacrifice increased over time. Skeletons found in later period mass graves show signs of having been hastily and brutally dispatched, a far cry from the elaborate, individualized rituals depicted in earlier art. This could be a sign of desperation. As their society began to face environmental and political crises, prolonged droughts, deforestation, overpopulation, and increased conflict, their response was to double down on their religious obligations. If the old rituals weren't working, it must be because the gods were not satisfied. The only answer was more blood, more hearts, more offerings. And what of the common people? While the most spectacular rituals were performed by the elite, the worldview they represented permeated every level of society. The farmer in his maize field, the potter at his wheel, the weaver at her loom, all of them lived in the same sacred cosmos. They may have made humbler offerings, perhaps the blood of a chicken or a turkey, or a few drops of their own blood let from an earlobe or a finger, but they shared the same fundamental belief that their actions, their piety, were necessary for the survival of the world. They also shared the burden of supporting the massive temple complexes, the priestly class, and the warrior elite. They paid tribute in the form of crops, goods, and labour, and sometimes they paid with their own lives or the lives of their children. It's a misconception that all sacrificial victims were foreign captives. While high-status enemies were the most prized offerings, commoners could also be chosen for sacrifice, particularly in times of extreme crisis. The discovery of mass graves containing the bodies of ordinary men, women, and children attests to this grim reality. Now imagine living in a society where, as environmental conditions worsened, as the droughts became longer and the maize harvest smaller, the demands of the state and the priesthood only grew more intense. The very rulers who were supposed to guarantee cosmic order were presiding over a world that was visibly falling apart. At some point, the faith that had sustained them for 1,000 years must have begun to crack. The social contract, the belief that the sacrifices of the many, led by the divine king, would bring the favour of the gods, was breaking. The gods were eating, but the people were starving. This is likely a key factor in the so-called classic Maya collapse. It wasn't a single event, but a complex process of political fragmentation and depopulation that occurred over more than a century. In the southern lowlands, the heartland of the classic Maya civilization, one by one, the great cities were abandoned. The Maya stopped carving their elaborate stone monuments, their stelae with the histories of their divine kings. The massive ceremonial centres fell silent, and the jungle began the slow, relentless process of reclaiming what had been built. The people did not simply vanish. Many likely migrated north to cities in the Yucatan Peninsula, like Chichen Itza and Mayapan, which continued to flourish for several more centuries. But the political and religious system of the classic period, with its divine kings and their bloody compact with the gods, had failed. It had collapsed under the weight of its own internal contradictions. The sexual and sacrificial practices we find so terrifying were, for them, the very bedrock of their existence. But a bedrock built on blood and pain is ultimately unstable. When the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, they found a Maya world that was already a shadow of its former self. The great southern cities were long overgrown, and the northern cities were often engaged in petty conflicts. The Spanish, with their own brand of religious fervour and intolerance, saw the remaining Maya practices, the bloodletting, the sacrifices, as demonic, a justification for conquest and forced conversion. Bishop Diego de Landa, the same chronicler who gave us so much information about Maya life, was also responsible for the infamous auto da fe at Mani in 1562, where he burned countless Maya codices and religious artefacts, effectively destroying a vast library of their knowledge and history. He sought to wipe out their demonic sexuality and replace it with Catholic chastity, to erase their pagan sacrifices and replace them with the sacrifice of the Mass. In doing so, he and others like him severed the Maya from the last vestiges of a cosmological worldview that had endured for millennia. They forced a people whose religion was written on the body, in acts of blood and creation, to adopt a faith that was written in a book, a faith that drew a hard line between the sacred and the profane, the spirit and the flesh. And with that, a universe of meaning as complex and magnificent as any of their temples was effectively lost, buried under the rubble of conquest and misunderstanding. The echoes of this lost world, however, did not fall completely silent. They reverberate in the present, hidden in plain sight, a ghostly testament to the resilience of a culture that refused to be entirely erased. To journey through the lands of the Maya today, through Chiapas, Guatemala, Belize, and the Yucatan Peninsula, is to walk through a landscape haunted by this powerful, bloody, and sacred past. The worldview that demanded genital bloodletting and beating hearts is gone, but its shadow lingers, fused and syncretized with the very religion that sought to destroy it. This is perhaps the most fascinating and least understood chapter of the story. The conquest did not result in a simple replacement of one belief system with another. It resulted in a collision, a violent and creative fusion that gave birth to a new spiritual reality, one that is uniquely Mesoamerican. The Maya, with a genius for adaptation born of centuries of survival, took the symbols and saints of Catholicism and mapped them onto their own ancient enduring cosmos. The cross to the Spanish was a symbol of Christ's sacrifice. To many Maya, it became a new representation of the Kaaba, the sacred world tree, the cosmic axis at the centre of their universe. Jesus Christ, a God who sacrifices his own blood to save humanity, resonated deeply with a people whose own gods and kings had done the same to maintain cosmic order. In the highlands of Chiapas, Mexico, in the town of San Juan Chamula, there is a church unlike any other in the world. From the outside, it looks like a typical Spanish colonial church. But step inside, and you are plunged into another reality. The floor is covered not with pews, but with a thick carpet of green pine needles, evoking the sacred forest floor. The air is dense with the smoke of thousands of candles and the powerful scent of burning copal, the same incense their ancestors burned as offerings. There is no priest. Instead, traditional healers, or curanderos, move among the worshippers, who kneel on the floor in family groups, chanting in their native Tzotzil language. Their rituals are a stunning blend of Catholic and pre-Columbian practices. They make offerings of candles, whose colours have specific meanings, just as their ancestors' offerings did. And in a practice that would horrify a conventional Catholic priest, they sacrifice chickens inside the church, right there on the pine needle floor, believing the life force of the animal can help to heal the sick or ward off evil. They drink a potent sugarcane liquor called pox, which they believe opens a channel for communication with the spirit world. And they drink Coca-Cola, whose burps are seen as a way of expelling evil spirits from the body. This is not a mockery of Catholicism. It is a living, breathing syncretism, a testament to a worldview where the old gods have not died, but have simply put on the masks of Catholic saints. This same syncretism can be seen in their understanding of life, death, and the body. The ancient belief in a life force, or cur, persists. Illness is often seen not just as a biological malfunction, but as a spiritual affliction, a case of soul loss, where a part of one's spiritual essence has become detached. Healing is therefore a ritual process, involving a curandero who must journey into the spirit world to retrieve the lost soul part. This is a direct echo of the shamanistic vision quests of their ancestors, the very quests that were induced by the agony of ritual bloodletting. The terrifying sexual practices are gone, but the underlying belief that the body is a conduit for spiritual energy remains. The modern Maya have not forgotten their history. The stories of the Popol Vuh are still told. The sacred 260-day calendar is still kept by ritual specialists in some highland communities, used to determine auspicious days for planting, for marriage, for rituals. And the ruins of their great cities are not just tourist attractions to them. They are sacred sites, places of immense spiritual power, where they still go to perform ceremonies and leave offerings, speaking to the spirits of their ancestors, who they believe still dwell among the stones. But this legacy is not just one of spiritual survival. It is also a legacy of trauma. The conquest and the centuries of oppression, exploitation, and outright genocide that followed have left deep scars. The Guatemalan Civil War, which raged from 1960 to 1996, was in many ways a continuation of the conquest. The state military, often with the backing of foreign powers, carried out a systematic campaign of terror against the indigenous Maya population, resulting in the deaths of over 200,000 people. It was a period of unimaginable horror, where villages were wiped out, women were systematically raped, and community leaders were tortured and killed. The justifications for this violence often echoed the language of the Spanish conquistadors, painting the Maya as a backward, subversive, and pagan element that needed to be cleansed from the body politic. The world of ritualized violence that we explored, the world of the ancient Maya, was in many ways less savage than the politically motivated, industrial-scale slaughter of the 20th century. The ancient Maya sacrificed their enemies to feed their gods and maintain the cosmos. The modern state murdered its own citizens to maintain its grip on power and protect the economic interests of a small elite. This shared history of suffering and resistance has forged a powerful modern Maya identity. Today, there are millions of Maya people who are fighting to reclaim their heritage, to revitalize their languages, and to protect their ancestral lands from deforestation and exploitation. They are scholars, activists, artists, and farmers, navigating the complexities of the modern world while drawing strength from a cultural and spiritual legacy that is thousands of years old. When a modern Maya activist stands up to a multinational corporation that is trying to clear their ancestral forest, they are echoing the defiance of their ancestors who resisted the Spanish. When a community decides to reject industrial agriculture and return to planting the traditional varieties of maize, the sacred flesh their creation story says they are made from, they are performing an act of profound cultural and spiritual resistance. The story of the Maya's terrifying sexual and sacrificial practices is not, therefore, just a lurid tale from a distant past. It is the story of a complex and sophisticated worldview, a way of understanding humanity's place in the cosmos that was both brutal and beautiful. It is the story of a civilization that rose to incredible heights of artistic and scientific achievement, fueled by a sacred compact written in blood. And it is the story of a people who have endured 5 centuries of conquest and oppression, and whose ancient spirit, though scarred and transformed, refuses to die. The screams from the top of the pyramid have long since faded, but if you listen closely, in the murmur of a prayer, in a Chiapan church, in the rustle of the maize leaves in a Guatemalan field, you can still hear the echo of their indomitable heart. To truly understand the Maya, to grasp the sheer, alien audacity of their worldview, we have to perform a difficult mental exercise. We have to strip away our own deeply ingrained assumptions about the self, the body, and the sacred. We live in a world that has been profoundly shaped by the Abrahamic religions and the European Enlightenment, a world that preaches the sanctity of the individual, the privacy of the body, and the separation of church and state. Our modern moral compass is oriented towards the preservation of individual life and the pursuit of personal happiness. For the classic Maya, this compass would have been utterly meaningless. Their moral universe was not centered on the individual, but on the collective, and beyond that, on the cosmos itself. The highest good was not personal survival or fulfillment, but the maintenance of cosmic balance, the upholding of the sacred covenant between humanity and the gods. In this framework, an act that we see as the ultimate violation, the taking of a human life, could be for them the ultimate act of piety. A practice we view as horrific, self-mutilation was, for them, a sacred duty and a gateway to the divine. This is a profoundly challenging concept to absorb. Our instinct is to judge, to label their practices as barbaric or savage. But to do so is to refuse to engage with them on their own terms. It is to commit an act of intellectual colonialism, imposing our own values on a civilization that operated on a completely different philosophical and spiritual plane. A more fruitful, though perhaps more disturbing approach is to ask, what did they achieve with this worldview? The answer is quite simply a civilization that was, for over a millennium, one of the most advanced and sophisticated on the planet. Their system of belief, for all its brutality, was not a sign of primitivism. It was the engine of their cultural dynamism. It was the desire to please the gods and track the celestial cycles for ritual purposes that drove them to develop a system of mathematics that included the concept of zero, independently of the old world. It was the need to record the dynastic histories of their divine kings and their ritual obligations that led them to create the most complex and nuanced writing system ever developed in the ancient Americas. It was the mandate to build fitting stages for their cosmic dramas, for their sacrifices and their ceremonies, that fueled the creation of an architecture of breathtaking scale and astronomical precision. The pyramids at Tikal, soaring over 200 feet out of the jungle canopy, were not just tombs or temples. They were man-made sacred mountains, designed to be stages for the rituals that renewed the world. The layout of their cities was a map of the cosmos, a physical manifestation of their sacred geography. And their art, the vibrant murals of Bonampak, the intricate carvings of Palenque, the stunningly expressive ceramics found in their tombs. This was not art for art's sake. It was a tool of religious and political power, a way of making the supernatural world visible, of documenting the rituals that sustained it. The very scenes of bloodletting and sacrifice that shock us were to them depictions of the highest moral and aesthetic value. They were beautiful because they were true, because they depicted the fundamental reality of their existence. This forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that human civilization is not a simple, linear march from savagery to enlightenment. It is a complex and often contradictory tapestry. A society can be capable of both profound intellectual achievement and acts of incredible violence. And in the case of the Maya, these two things were not contradictory. They were inextricably linked. This understanding should also cause us to reflect on our own civilization. We recoil at the thought of human sacrifice, yet our own history is awash with blood spilled in the name of gods, nations, and ideologies. We condemn their ritualized violence, yet we consume a diet of hyper-violent entertainment and live in a world where the technologies of warfare have reached a level of destructive power the Maya could never have imagined. We may no longer pull hearts from the chests of captives on stone altars, but we have found other, more efficient ways to sacrifice human lives on the altars of progress, profit, and political power. The Maya believed the universe demanded blood to sustain it. Have we truly escaped that paradigm, or have we just disguised it? Have we simply replaced the flint knife and the stone altar with the drone strike and the stock market? This is not to create a false equivalence or to excuse the brutality of the past. It is to recognize that the human capacity for both creation and destruction, for both sublime spirituality and terrifying violence, is not something that belongs to a savage past. It is a fundamental part of the human condition, a dark thread that runs through all of our histories, including our own. The story of the Maya is a mirror, and looking into it can be a deeply unsettling experience. It shows us a different way of being human, a different way of constructing reality. It reminds us that our own worldview, which we often take for granted as natural and universal, is just one of countless possibilities, and it reveals the profound and often dangerous power of belief. The Maya built a world on the belief that they were active participants in a sacred, ongoing creation. That belief inspired them to create wonders, but it also demanded a terrible price in blood and suffering. Their story is a cautionary tale about the heights a civilization can reach when it is unified by a powerful and all-encompassing ideology, but also about the inherent dangers of a system that places cosmic duty above individual human life. It is a reminder that the line between religious devotion and lethal fanaticism can be terrifyingly thin. And so, we are left with the ruins, the ghosts, the echoes. We are left to piece together their story from the silent stones and the fragmented whispers of their descendants. We can never fully know what it was like to be them, to see the world through their eyes, to feel the ecstasy of the sacrificial moment. But in trying to understand, in daring to look into the abyss of their alien worldview without flinching, we can perhaps learn something profound about the vast, strange, and often terrifying spectrum of human possibility. The jungle has reclaimed their pyramids, but the questions they pose, questions about the nature of God, of humanity, and of sacrifice, continue to haunt us. Let's pause for a moment, here in the shadow of the blood-soaked pyramid. We have walked through the public square of Maya ritual. We have witnessed the king pierce his own flesh, the queen pull a thorny rope through her tongue, and the captive have his still-beating heart torn from his chest. We have seen the logic, the terrible cosmic necessity that drove these acts. We have seen how this system built a civilization and then perhaps helped to tear it down. But there is a chamber we have not yet entered, a space even more intimate and terrifying than the sacrificial altar. We have to go beyond the what and the why and dare to ask, how? How, in the name of all that is human, did they endure it? How did a young nobleman bring a stingray spine to the most sensitive part of his own body and not recoil in a madness of pure agony? How did a king or a queen transform what should be a moment of unbearable, mind-shattering pain into a moment of divine communion? The answer is not simply they were tough or they were brainwashed. The answer is that they had developed a sophisticated, psycho-spiritual technology for dismantling the self. They had learned how to use pain not as a barrier, but as a doorway. To understand this, we must first understand the world they inhabited. To the Maya, the jungle was not a collection of plants and animals. It was a conscious, living entity, saturated with divinity. The great saber tree was not a symbol of the cosmos. It was the cosmos, its roots plunging deep into the watery underworld of Xibalba, its trunk forming the middle plane of human existence, and its branches soaring into the 13 levels of the heavens. The jaguar was not an animal. It was the god of the underworld, the avatar of the night sun on its terrifying journey through the darkness. The cenotes, those deep water-filled sinkholes, were not just sources of fresh water. They were the literal mouths of the underworld, portals through which one could speak to the dead and the gods of creation and destruction. Every mountain was a sacred ancestor, every cave a potential gateway to another reality. There was no line between the natural and the supernatural. The world was alive, sentient, and constantly demanding interaction. It was a world that spoke, and to hear it you had to learn its language, And that language was not one of gentle whispers. It was one of ecstasy, trance, and trauma. The human body, in this worldview, was a direct reflection of this living cosmos. It was a microcosm of the universe. A person's head was their own personal heaven. Their heart was the sun, the source of their life and heat, and the flow of their blood mirrored the sacred rivers and the rains that nourished the earth. Their bones were the stones of the world, their hair the grass and the trees, and their sexual organs were the ultimate source of earthly creation, the human equivalent of the divine act that birthed the universe. Therefore, to perform a ritual upon the body was to perform a ritual upon the cosmos in miniature. To let blood from the penis was to fertilize the cosmic field, to make the universe fecund. To let blood from the tongue, the organ of speech, was to give a voice to the ancestors, to make the sacred word flesh. This wasn't metaphor. It was a deeply held, literal truth. And if your body was the cosmos, then altering your consciousness was a way of altering reality itself. This is where we must talk about the chemical keys they used to unlock the doors of perception. The Maya were master pharmacologists. They had an encyclopedic knowledge of the psychoactive properties of the plants and animals in their environment. They drank balshay, a fermented beverage made from honey and the bark of a leguminous tree, which had intoxicating and likely hallucinogenic properties. They consumed psilocybin mushrooms, which they called the flesh of the gods. They used the venom of certain toads, rich in bufotenin, a powerful psychedelic. They smoked immense quantities of wild tobacco, or Nicotiana rustica, a plant so potent it could induce trance states and out-of-body experiences. They used the seeds of the morning glory, rich in LSA, a cousin to LSD. These substances were not used for recreation. They were sacred medicines, tools for spiritual navigation. They were ingested by the priests, the shamans, and the nobles in preparation for ritual. They were the catalysts that began the process of dissolving the ego, of unmooring the soul from the anchor of everyday reality. They opened the mind to the terror and the glory of the spirit world, preparing it for the even more powerful catalyst that was to come: pain. Here is the crux of their psycho-spiritual technology. The process began with fasting and sensory deprivation, weakening the body's hold on the mind. Then came the ingestion of powerful hallucinogens, shattering the familiar patterns of thought and perception. The rhythmic chanting, the drumming, the disorienting dance of the torchlight, all of this worked to deepen the trance. And then, at the peak of this altered state, came the pain. A sharp, undeniable, all-consuming agony. For a mind already untethered from reality by drugs and ritual, this agony was not processed as a mere physical sensation. It became something else entirely. It became the voice of the god, the touch of the ancestor, the raw energy of the cosmos itself pouring into the body. The pain was the final key, the one that shattered the last vestiges of the self and allowed the individual to merge completely with the divine. The scream that was torn from their throat was not just a reaction to a physical wound. It was the sound of the barrier between worlds being ripped asunder. In that moment of transcendent agony, they were no longer a king, a queen, a mere mortal. They were a portal, a living gateway through which cosmic power flowed. This experience, this ecstasis, was the ultimate source of a ruler's authority. Any man could claim to be descended from the gods, but a king who could publicly pierce his own body, enter a death-like trance, and emerge with a prophecy from the vision serpent, was a man who had proven his divinity in the most undeniable way possible. His power was not theoretical, it was written on his own bleeding flesh for all to see. Now let us descend from the pyramid's peak and walk the stone causeways into the heart of the Maya city, into the homes of the common people. For the worldview we've explored, this terrifying and ecstatic union of flesh, blood, and divinity was not confined to the gilded elite. It was the very air the people breathed, the soil in which their lives were rooted. The farmer who woke before dawn to tend his milpa, his small plot of maize, beans, and squash, did not see himself as a mere labourer. He was a participant in the same cosmic drama as his king. His actions, though humbler, were just as essential to the maintenance of universal order. When he planted a kernel of maize, he was not just planting a seed. He was burying a tiny piece of the flesh of the maize god, entrusting it to the underworld, with the faith that it would be reborn. Just as the sun was reborn every morning after its perilous journey through the darkness, His world was governed by the same sacred calendar that dictated the king's rituals. The 260-day Tzolk'in told him when to plant, when to harvest, when to marry, when to perform the small but vital rituals that kept his family and his crops in harmony with the cosmos. He may not have had a stingray spine or an obsidian blade, but he had his own tools for honouring this sacred compact. He would let a few drops of his own blood from his earlobe or his finger, mingling it with the corn seeds before planting. A personal offering to fertilise the earth. He would burn copal incense at a small house altar, the fragrant smoke carrying his prayers to the gods, a miniature version of the great plumes of smoke that rose from the temple tops. His sex life too was woven into this sacred tapestry. Intercourse was not just for procreation, it was an act of creation that mirrored the divine origins of the universe, but it was also an act fraught with spiritual danger. A man's semen was a precious, finite resource, a vessel of his life force. To spill it needlessly, to engage in sex during periods of ritual fasting or preparation for a sacred duty, was to weaken himself and pollute the community. Warriors, for example, were required to be celibate before a battle. To engage in sex was to dissipate the vital energy needed for combat, to risk not just his own life, but the success of the entire campaign. This belief created a society with a complex and often contradictory relationship with sexuality. On one hand, their art and mythology were filled with phallic imagery and overt celebrations of fertility. The penis was a symbol of divine creative power. On the other hand, their daily lives were governed by a strict code of sexual conduct that demanded abstinence and ritual purity at key moments. It was a sexuality of extremes, swinging between sacred duty and dangerous taboo. And what of the women of the common class? Their lives too were a constant negotiation with the sacred. A woman's body was a mystery, a source of both life and potential pollution. Menstruation in particular was seen as a powerful and dangerous time. A menstruating woman was in a liminal state, caught between worlds. Her blood was a potent substance, and she was often required to be secluded, to avoid contact with men who were preparing for war or ritual, lest her power interfere with theirs. Yet this power was not seen as inherently evil. It was a manifestation of her unique connection to the moon goddess, Ix-Chel, a deity of fertility and childbirth, but also of destruction and floods. A woman's greatest purpose, her most sacred duty, was to bear children, to bring new souls into the world to honour the gods and work the fields. Childbirth was her battlefield, her moment of supreme sacrifice, and it was a dangerous one. Mortality rates for both mother and child were brutally high. A woman who died in childbirth was afforded the same honour as a warrior who died in battle. She was seen as a martyr, a sacrifice to the gods of creation, and her spirit was believed to accompany the sun on its daily journey across the sky. The family home itself, a simple hut of wattle and daub, with a thatched roof, was a microcosm of the cosmos, just as the temple was. The central hearth was the heart of the home, the axis mundi around which family life revolved. The burial of ancestors beneath the floor of the house was not a sign of disrespect. It was a way of keeping the family line connected, of ensuring that the spirits of the dead remained present to offer guidance and protection. Life was a continuous cycle of birth, death, and rebirth, played out within the sacred space of the home, which in turn was a reflection of the sacred landscape of the city, which was a reflection of the sacred structure of the universe. But this intimate connection to the sacred also brought with it a constant, gnawing anxiety. The world was alive with powerful, often capricious, supernatural forces. The gods were not benevolent shepherds, they were powerful beings who demanded constant appeasement. A sudden illness, a failed crop, a difficult birth, these were not random misfortunes. They were signs of a disruption in the cosmic balance, a failure of ritual, a debt owed to an angry god or a malevolent spirit. And this meant that daily life was filled with a sense of profound obligation and a constant low-level fear. Every action, from weaving a piece of cloth to preparing a meal, was imbued with ritual significance and the potential for spiritual misstep. Charms and amulets were worn to ward off the evil eye. Incantations were whispered to protect children from the spirits of the night. Offerings were left at crossroads and caves, the dwelling places of powerful earth spirits. It was an exhausting, mentally taxing way to live, a life lived on the knife's edge between divine favour and divine wrath. When we look at the great silent ruins of the Maya cities, it is easy to forget this. We see the grand temples and the astronomical observatories, and we imagine a life of intellectual and artistic splendor. But for the vast majority of the people who lived in the shadow of those temples, life was a precarious and relentless struggle, not just for physical survival, but for spiritual survival as well. Their story is a powerful reminder that the grandest civilizations are built not just on stone and mortar, but on the daily toil, the fervent beliefs, and the quiet anxieties of millions of ordinary people living out their lives in the shadow of gods who were both their creators and their most terrifying predators.